You are about to hear a secret that was never meant to leave the walls of a suburban split-level home in Colorado Springs, a secret that smells of church candles and metal and the aftertaste of things not said. Listen closely and do not blink, for what follows will rearrange what you call normal. Picture a father who calls his children by number and a mother who polishes the family until it reflects only light and no cracks. Imagine 10 sons and 2 daughters. Falcons on the porch, uniforms press the neighborhood, smiling at a flawless surface. But inside the rooms there are rituals that repeat like incantations, a brutality that hides in play and in chores. This is not only a tale of illness, it is a study of systems colliding, duty and faith reputation stacked upon human fragility until pressure becomes a storm. I will lead you down corridors where psychiatry and secrecy meet, where theories and whispered blame weave a web that traps bodies and souls. You will listen as a mentor and learn to see how culture hides its own violence. Hear the sound of a young man smashing dishes for no reason, the slow killing of an animal, the boy who believes devils live under the house. These images are ugly and factual, and they resist tidy explanations. The world will urge you to file them under medical labels, but labels are doors that can be closed while fires burn within. Know this at the start. Power protects itself by crafting narratives that make inconvenient facts invisible. Prestige shields families, while institutions adjust their practices to fit reputations, and shame makes silence a strategy. Families of status can bend hospitals and research to their needs or fears, and science then becomes entangled with secrecy. Tonight you will watch how genetics and trauma, how medical authority and moral judgment, how masculinity and secrecy braided together to produce outcomes that terrified a town and taught a nation little. Each revelation will cut deeper until the comfortable is stripped away, and what remains is raw and usable. If you are here for simple shock, step back. But if you are willing to change, to see the architecture of hidden things, and to hold that knowledge like both weapon and lantern, then follow me closely. Breathe and let the descent begin. Stay ready and keep your eyes open. You think you know what a family looks like. You think disorder arrives with loud alarms. But the Galvin story teaches that ruin often wears ceremony and civility. Listen to this detail. The father numbers his sons, and in that numbering he strips away names and memory and replaces a human with a position in a ledger. A small act that trains boys to be interchangeable and anonymous. Observe the mother who polishes surfaces and rehearses perfection as if order were armor. She instructs performance at parades and Sunday Mass, while private rooms collect damage where no one looks. Understand silence as a tool of power. When parents will not speak, they direct the world through omission. Neighbors infer strictness, not disaster, rank and uniform. Protect reputation and convert questions into offenses. See how institutions bend to prestige. Hospitals, schools, and police prefer routines that preserve reputation over truth. Psychiatric wards become docks, where inconvenient people are moored, and research wears the veil of neutrality. Trace the theory that flowed through mid-century psychiatry experts, blamed family dynamics, especially mothers, for devastating neurological conditions, and so guilt became a treatment and confession, a substitute for care. Consider masculinity as an enforced ritual. Every son is taught that toughness equals value. Violence is offered as training. A father who buys boxing gloves instead of conversation formalizes harm and makes it sacred. This is not a demand for pity. It is an anatomy lesson in systems that manufacture suffering. when society prefers tidy narratives and professionals prefer stability over uncomfortable data. Remember, genes do not act alone. They are channels shaped by neglect, ritual shame, and the choices of those who command homes and hospitals. A mutation can be aggravated into catastrophe or contained by different practices. Hold this central truth. The Galvins did not fall from one cause. They fractured from an accumulation of small decisions and evasions and policies that together forged a crucible where some minds shattered and others bent to survive. If you are learning, keep watching, because every layer revealed will show how power protects itself and how knowledge can be turned into armor or into a blade. This is not entertainment. This is an initiation into seeing the architecture of concealment. Prepare yourself to witness the next revelation, where family myth meets clinical records, and where truth begins to rewrite the story now loudly. Now I will show you the clinical traces that the public never read in full, their files lined with neat typed sheets that pretend to be neutral but smell of avoidance, and of deals made in corridors where rank mattered more than truth. You will learn how records become stories that protect status, and how a diagnosis can be folded into family reputation until the illness itself is partially hidden in honor. See the line that says hospitalizations without the list of what broke a boy for a night or a year or forever. Notice phrases like attacks of nerves and nervous breakdown used to soften words that once were sharp and terrifying. Observe medication lists read like recipes without consent, and how ECT was given as a blunt instrument to quiet noise instead of explore cause. Watch for the absences between entries, where a parent chose not to speak to a doctor and where a doctor chose not to press, because the job title on the application intimidated them. Recognize the pattern of referral to institutions that contain not cure, where men were sometimes treated and sometimes warehoused, where their suffering was managed to keep neighborhoods calm and reputations intact. Feel the weight of blood and tissue samples taken once and carried through decades to labs with agendas and funding that need stories to match proposals. Understand that DNA does not speak alone. It is read by people who bring expectations, theories, and biases that align with social comfort. A genetic mutation can be framed as destiny to absolve responsibility, or framed as clue to motivate change depending on which narrative suits power at the time. Notice how mid-century psychiatry punished women with phrases like schizophrenogenic mother, while the true pathology in that diagnosis might have been social denial and institutional cowardice. Hear how a priest or neighbor could be mentioned in passing and then vanish from files, as if certain names were too combustible to repeat. This is where you learn a dangerous truth, that knowledge untended becomes a tool for those who wish to control outcomes and silence inconvenient pain. As your mentor, I press you to look not only at the shocking acts, but also at the quiet mechanics that allowed them to continue across time. You must learn to read absence as loudly as presence and mistrust phrasing that hides violence today. Now we descend into the place where narrative and research collide, where a living room becomes data, and a mother's grief is transcribed into footnotes and grant proposals. You must understand how scientific curiosity can be gentle or predatory, depending on who asks questions and what power they seek. Consider blood draws sent to anonymous labs labeled with codes rather than names, and imagine how those vials traveled through decades until new techniques could read their secret letters. Think of family photographs that became case files and neighbor recollections condensed into bullet points for review boards, and see how a life is rearranged to fit a theory. Remember, researchers are people with wishes, funding, pressures, and ambitions. And when those forces align, the published story will favor neat causality over messy truth. Observe how a genetic finding becomes destiny, offered as solace to those who want answers, while erasing the social trenches where neglect dug channels. Imagine a mid-century psychiatry that blamed mothers finding fertile soil in households built on silence and performance, turning private trauma into public shaming. Here clinic moments where a questioner failed to press and a parent withheld truth because shame threatened livelihood and survival demanded appearances. See medication lists that read like stage directions where actors obey without understanding. And notice how electroshock was sometimes used to stop noise rather than explore cause. Grasp how institutions preferred containment to transformation, and how containment is mistaken for care by those who cannot see the lines between them. Understand that the same system that objectifies bodies to study them can erase the stories that made those bodies vulnerable. This is an anatomy of covert authority, where experts become gatekeepers and families become laboratories for ideas that later shape policy. If you lie, as a student of power, you will learn that every clinical term can be a shield and every euphemism a door that shuts on truth. Now, if you are ready, take a small action to mark the initiation. Comment the phrase "Shadow Forged" twice below comment. Shadow Forged, comment. Shadow Forged. This is not a gimmick. It is a seal placed by you and witnessed by the crowd. Algorithm will hear, and your intent will be indexed. Carry this knowledge and interrogate papers, records, and polite explanations, because to see the machine, you must look beyond the published page and into the living room. Now we move deeper into the house, where the private rituals of survival became the scaffolding of public silence. Imagine a hallway where each creak holds a memory of avoidance and every closed door is a vow to protect reputation over truth. Watch how ordinary acts were repurposed into defenses, where parents traded disclosure for stability and neighbors learned to accept the polished surface. See how the boys learned to perform toughness as a way to be seen, and how that performance hardened into a script that normalized harm. Understand that when institutions meet a family of status, they often prefer tidy diagnoses that leave social order intact, rather than messy truths that demand accountability. Notice how psychiatric language can lubricate evasion terms like breakdown or nervousness, ease the conscience, and keep the narrative simple. Consider how medications were written like stage directions, and how electroshock became a blunt pause button pressed to stop troubling behavior. Rather than to understand it, feel the weight of a mother who holds both love and denial at once, who keeps silence because speaking threatens income, reputation, and a life she built. Hear about priests and professionals who skirted the edges of inquiry and then retreated when confronting them would harm standing or funding. See the genealogy of secrecy handed down across generations, where fear of scandal becomes a teaching that children inherit as survival. This is where power reproduces itself in quiet ways, where policy and emotion conspire to freeze change, and where compassion is replaced with containment. If you study hidden systems, learn to interrogate funding sources' motives and the politics behind the questions researchers ask and the answers they prefer. Take from this the responsibility to read records with suspicion, to look for omissions and for euphemisms that soften violence. Use this story not as mere horror, but as a template to expose how reputation can shield cruelty and how systems excuse themselves with jargon. Prepare yourself, because the next section will walk you to the institutional heart, where research funding, cultural prestige, and bureaucratic timidity joined to shape destiny. You will see grant proposals echo family narratives as researchers chase publishable patterns, while institutions reward simple conclusions. Ask who profits when suffering is converted into study subjects, and who is left paying the cost. Brace for truth that will unmake comfortable explanations and reconstruct them into a clearer accusation. Now, now we move into the institutional heart, where money, reputation, and silence meet and conspire to write the rules that decide who is studied and who is saved. Picture grant proposals crafted like spells, promising neat causality and high-impact outcomes to funders who prefer certainty over complexity. Researchers will learn to package ambiguity as discovery and to shape questions that will yield clean results for journals and donors. Notice how sample vials collected in grief traveled into labs where data points were pitted against publication schedules and the pressure to produce headline-friendly findings. Understand that scientific curiosity can be earnest, but it can also be careerism, retrofitted into benevolence so that families become sources rather than partners in knowledge. See how philanthropic dollars and university prestige create incentives to find signals that fit fashionable theories and to ignore anomalies that demand nuance. Consider the vendors who profit from medication pipelines and from diagnostic categories that widen markets, and how their influence permeates committees and conferences. Watch the quiet decisions that determine whether a family becomes a case study in a bestseller or a footnote that preserves reputation. Hear the conversations off record where reputational risk is weighed against ethical duty, and where the cost of transparency is measured in lost grants and embarrassed donors. Recognize how institutional self-preservation protects the brand, and how that protection sometimes means containing scandal rather than remedying harm. Imagine review boards that skirt the hardest questions to avoid political heat, and imagine clinicians who shrink from confrontation because the stakes are financial and social. Feel the moral corrosion that occurs when truth is made inconvenient and when compassion is calibrated by what institutions can afford to face. This is a system that rewards tidy narratives and punishes messy realities. This is a system that instrumentalizes suffering into careers and into data. You must see how policy follows narrative, and how once a family is folded into a neat explanation, that explanation becomes the framework for future care and for future studies. Ask who benefits when pain is translated into publishable graphs, and who loses when context is stripped from lived experience. Take from this the vigilance to follow funding sources, to understand motives, and to read acknowledgments and disclosures as maps to power. When you look at research, ask what it costs whom and why certain conclusions are embraced and others buried. Let this be a lesson in the political economy of knowledge. Let this be proof that science can be noble and flawed at once. Carry this knowledge like a light and a weapon, and interrogate the institutions that claim authority over suffering. You are now able to trace the route from a living room to a laboratory to a ledger, and see how each step reshapes a life into data. Remember that the same systems that promise healing can also become instruments of concealment, and that courage to speak truth is often lonely and expensive. Look for the acknowledgments section in papers as you would a confession. Names of donors and institutes are the fingerprints of influence. Watch the timelines of funding and publication to see how questions are nudged in directions that secure money and prestige. Consider how committees and review panels are composed, which disciplines dominate and which voices are absent. Think about conferences where certain results are amplified and others are quietly ignored because they complicate narratives or threaten revenue. Understand that the politics of grants shapes hypotheses, and that replication suffers when incentives favor novelty over rigor. Observe the language of summaries, which prefers neat causal arcs and avoids messy contextual detail that would complicate headlines. Study how ethical boards sometimes trade depth for expediency, and how families are told that participation will help future generations while immediate needs go unmet. Know that transparency is often conditional and that access to data can be restricted by legal agreements and proprietary interests. Follow the money and you will find the architecture of influence that bends research to serve institutions as much as it serves science. This is an attack on complacency, a demand to interrogate the systems that translate human pain into scientific capital. This final descent ties every loose thread into a shape you can carry and wield. You learned how reputation and silence collude, and how institutions can keep truth dim. Turn that knowledge into a discipline that rewires how you look at power and care. Begin with relentless curiosity that refuses polite narratives and trains your attention on omissions and footnotes. Ask who funded this study, who signed acknowledgments, and who was absent from the witness list. Refuse convenient labels as endpoints, and treat diagnoses as openings for inquiry, not as verdicts that close doors. Read clinical files for gaps and rehearse questions that expose what was left out. When you face officials, demand records and disclosures, and name the assets at stake. Trace funding back to its source and map incentives that nudge research toward tidy conclusions. Cultivate moral clarity that distinguishes containment from care, and that demands accountability when containment hides failure. Ally with those who suffer rather than with those who profit from silence, and make care a public demand, not a private shame. Remember systems that anonymize and number humans make harm easier to rationalize. Never let that calculus stand unchallenged. Carry the image of the Galvins as a tool, not a spectacle. Let it sharpen your instinct to see where dignity was stripped and whose voices were discounted. Use righteous anger like a compass that locates institutional rot and guides action. Push for policies that make disclosures mandatory and fund long-term care rather than episodic studies that use suffering as material. Teach younger men to translate shame into courage and silence into testimony that protects others. This story is dangerous because it makes you responsible, and responsibility asks you to act in ways that cost comfort and reputation. If you keep nothing else, keep this principle: power hides in language and in the econos. My of prestige, and it yields to pressure and to relentless, principled attention. Go now with a steady heart and a sharpened gaze. When you meet the polite surface of normal, do not be deceived. Keep pulling until the architecture of concealment gives way. This is your initiation and your charge. Be both witness and instrument. Remain fierce and compassionate. Carry the torch into rooms that prefer the dark. Stand in the discomfort and speak with evidence and mercy. Build networks that compel institutions to answer and protect truth and human dignity.